It's always a particular privilege to have the speaker before you talk about the important need for certain things that you're going to talk about. So having had an introduction like that, I'm going to talk pretty briefly. What I'm going to do is give you a sense of what doctors are thinking in the process of making a diagnosis. And specifically, I'm going to go through, everybody well understands the notion of criteria. If you have this and two things from this category, you have this diagnosis. And sometimes we do make diagnoses like that, but as Steve Cannon pointed out yesterday, that tends not to be for unusual diseases because we don't have the numbers or the committees to do that. So what I'm going to do is illustrate the other way of thinking, which is something that we call differential diagnosis. And so I'm going to illustrate that. The second thing I'm going to do is responding to the point that came up about the electromagnetic sensitivity, and it should be in the literature. I'm not going to put it in the literature, but I'm going to put it into diagnostic software that lots of people use. And that's sort of the first step of micro-publication to not only getting it known, but getting it actually used. And the third thing I'm going to do is give you a sense of how far we've come in genome interpretation by showing you some work that we've been doing in using diagnostic software to be the clinical front end to genome interpretation. And the combination of looking at big families and having a clinical perspective can actually give you answers that are surprisingly definitive and clear. And having just analyzed 15 genomes yesterday and gotten the right, last week and gotten the right answers within seconds on each of them, it's fun to be able to show you some of this to give you really concrete ideas of what doctors are doing in the process of diagnosis. So I'm going to do that using diagnostic software that we've developed, and that's actually how I got into periodic paralysis, was sort of a combination of what I was doing in my lab with ion channels in epilepsy and this that I was doing just sort of in my spare time with diagnostic software to deal with the question of how do you keep all these thousands of diseases in your mind. So what I'm going to do is just run through a very simple situation of you're starting out with somebody with intermittent episodes of paralysis or weakness. And I'll put in that we have a 10-year-old boy with recurrent paralysis. So what I'm going to do is put in that there was weakness. I should apologize. We have this really spiffy new version of the software, which I was thinking of showing you, but it doesn't yet do two of the things that the genome interpretation and the other. So this is the about to be defunct version of the software. Looks kind of old, is kind of old, and for those of you who are interested, I could show you later the other, but I just didn't think I had time for both. So recent onset of weakness and recurrent exacerbations, and you'll get a differential diagnosis, which here is not, here is on zebra mode, where zebras come up as often as horses. If you're on the regular mode, where focus on horses, you're going to be thinking about various types of periodic weakness, including a phenomenon called narcolepsy. People will have sleep problems and they will have paralysis episodes after laughing. And there's a whole bunch of things that we put into a list of other things to be thinking about when you're thinking about periodic paralysis, including things that are very different. But I'm going to leave that off just in the interest of time. And we have some of the periodic paralyses are pretty high here. And Anderson to Wheel is here also. These are organized by their relative probability. So, well, except that here the incidence, so this is by the fit, the clinical fit, as opposed to the incidence, because the incidence then puts a lot of these much lower down. So what a doctor does in doing diagnosis is often thinks of a whole bunch of things which have the core features, in this case, periodic paralysis, and then thinks of other findings that will change the, and this list of diseases which you see reproduced here when I put findings, this we refer to as a differential diagnosis, meaning lots of different diseases that could be the diagnosis. And so various other things will come up, and there's certain diseases with a gait disorder that will get eliminated if I say that that's absent, and swallowing difficulties, if we say that that's absent, it eliminates some, and so forth. Typically, after doing a few clinical findings, somebody will then move on to laboratory tests, and you can see here that things start coming up like, is your potassium in your serum low when you're symptomatic? And one of the things that's, one of the reasons it's phrased this way is that if you're not symptomatic, your potassium level will be typically indistinguishable from normal. As has been mentioned here before, when everybody's potassium level fluctuates, everybody has some sugar that results in insulin secretion, that results in the potassium going low. In the average person who doesn't have any of this, they may feel slightly odd, but probably don't feel anything at all. Somebody with hypokalemic periodic paralysis, they are at risk for going into a paralysis episode. And as people have pointed out, that you often hear stories of somebody being 1.9 in potassium during an incident. What happens is they typically will go into an episode at something like 3, but then as the muscle starts getting damaged, the muscle then swells up, and the muscle takes up both water and potassium, which is the major positively charged ion inside the muscle cell. So you have a positive feedback type of thing. So the purpose of having something like diagnostic software is your average doctor is not going to know any of these subtleties. The idea is let doctors communicate in what they know, and then give them choices that they can comment on, make distinctions that are important. And so one of the things we talked about the other day was that nobody's published anything about the electromagnetic field sensitivity. Years ago, with Emily, is it Low or Lau, or I'm not sure the pronunciation, where are you? Anyway, Lau. So Emily Lau was talking about this, and we arranged some blinded experiments where it was really pretty convincing that this really is a thing. We made the decision at the time that if we publish this now, people would think we're nuts. Let's wait till we find the gene. It's often the people for whom lidocaine is ineffective who have this phenomenon. We haven't put it in the software, but let me show you how easy it is to do that, and let's actually do that. And on some previous times, we've put in the cramps and pain and so forth in hypokalemic periodic paralysis. So I'm going to shift to the advanced mode, take hypokalemic periodic paralysis, go into the database, look at the profile of disease, and I happen to know we don't have it, yet I happen to know that put the electromagnetic field finding in with no diseases earlier today, so we could actually do it. So we'll put in the trigger of the electromagnetic field triggering the episodes, and so I need some data. So first of all, everybody with hypokalemic periodic paralysis, either yourself or the person you're representing, please put up your hand, just so we have a denominator. Okay, and now people who have the electromagnetic field sensitivity, that seems to be a trigger. Okay, I think I'm going to call that 10%, which is higher than I was imagining. So I'm just going to put that as 10%. I'm not.
How do you define electromagnetic field? Like, how do you know you're in an electromagnetic field that's more than?
Yeah. Okay. So sorry. Thank you for clarifying that. So typically, what people like Emily have noticed and described in a lot of detail is that you turn on a fluorescent light and they're at risk of going into a paralysis episode. You turn on a normal incandescent tungsten type of lamp and you're not. And there's much more electromagnetic field coming out from that. But in addition, Emily has described various, being near various pieces of equipment that are subsequently found with electromagnetic field meters to be important triggers. So most cases people won't know this, and this is one of the reasons it's not in the literature. Plus, you know, you can just imagine what is going to happen if people think, you know, people have to worry that everywhere there's electromagnetic field that they have to go mitigate that in some way. So it's something to be approached cautiously, but I agree it should be in the literature, and I'm going to put it in as the first step. We have put that in. So the other thing I wanted to show was what one does to interpret a genome. And there are lots of things that people do there's sort of several steps to interpreting a genome. One is you take somebody's genome, you break it up into a lot of pieces, you sequence it, you line them up. And that's the first step, which I'll put under sequencing. The second step is you go checking up about various things. What gene is that in? How unusual is that sequence? Does it look worrisome? And that's called annotation. And what we've been doing is the third step of taking what's called a variant table, of taking all the places where your genome is different from others. And an annotated variant table describes those in various ways. We take that in, we compare it, we then match up what seems to fit with the inheritance patterns in the family, and then what seems to fit with the clinical picture. And the whole field has been moving along tremendously. A few years ago, I showed one example that we had, and the one that I'm showing now is just sort of, I saw last week for the first time, and it startled me with sort of how good this is getting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a file and just show you this is, so I could have saved a file of the previous patient. But here is what we call the phenotype, in other words, the clinical findings. This is somebody with some abnormal EMG findings and muscular atrophy and so forth. And a whole bunch of diseases come up, and I can tell you it's not any of the first ones, it's sort of down here somewhere. This is before the genome analysis. There's lots of possibilities, and it's just certain diseases are very hard to diagnose clinically to get the exact genetic form. And as you can see here, many of them are specific forms of the same thing. So what I'm going to do now is import a variant file, and this is, I think, like 4 megabytes of information. And so this has 8,000 different variants. So this is a lot for people to process manually, obviously, and one needs to put them together. And this is from a family with, I believe it's a cousin. It's listed as unrelated, but that's just the way the terminology they were using for not in the same nuclear family. And this is called a pedigree file. It doesn't look like the standard pedigrees. It just says what the relationship, who's which parent, and so forth. And all we have in this case is two females. This we don't have DNA from the parents, I think we don't. Well, we'll see in a second. And on the basis of, you need all this information to interpret it. And then when you go back to the differential diagnosis, you get two of the diseases actually have come very high up in the differential diagnosis. And you still have the clinical findings, but you now also have genotype findings. And what this says is from this entire information, we came up with only 2 genes that were plausible. The green marking is what we call pertinence, which is a metric of just, if we took this out, if we didn't have this information, how different would it be? There's not much pertinence to the TTN gene variations because they have nothing to do with the clinical picture here. There is a huge amount of pertinence to the, whoops, this is the part we're supposed to not show. Yeah. Sorry, this isn't published yet, so I don't want to show the details of this in a public way. But so this gene variant turned out to be the one that explains the picture in this family. I can show you the details here, and this has the specific positions and stuff that I didn't want to show. So it looks like there's a whole bunch of different variants found in this gene. They're actually all, if you look at the chromosomal position, they're all at the exact same location, so they're all describing the same thing. And here there were only 2 individuals, the proband, which is the individual we're focusing on, and this other person who is a cousin. And both of them have the same variant, which we assign, it's a missense variant, which we assign a score of 3 in severity, like a frame shift deletion type of thing would be a 5. But part of the annotations are functional and conservation scores, and those give you a sense of how closely are these maintained through different species. In other words, giving you a measure of how important they are, and also functional scores of how likely is this change to make a difference. We also have some other forms of information. There's quality and depth scores of the reads, and also the number of shares in the database. In other words, how frequently this is seen in various, either 1 copy or 2 copies in a person. So this gives you a sense of how easy the process can actually be. People used to joke that we'd have the $1,000 genome, but it would require $1 million interpretation. And as you can see here, some of the clinical interpretation part is also very susceptible to being systematized. And frequently one gets a bunch of genes that fit, a few genes that fit with a known clinical picture, and some that are discovery genes. In other words, you find a gene, but it doesn't fit with a known clinical picture. And it's about, I think, 80-something% of genes don't so far we haven't assigned a clinical disease to. In this one, it actually seems to just be it relates to the same gene that we focused on, that it's just another call on the same position. And so this is like it's a remarkably definitive result, and this is becoming more common, and especially if one can do a person and a cousin or something like that. And one should note that this is also a dominant disease. In other words, you just need 1 copy. There were next to the gene variant was the number 50, meaning 50%. In other words, 1 copy out of 2. And so this is some of the same genetics that you see in most forms of periodic paralysis. So what I tried to do here was give you some sense of just what the cognitive process of diagnosis is actually like, what types of assistance there is to the physician in doing this, where you can remove the bias against rare diseases. and how in difficult situations one can do genome analysis. And this is the procedure that we're applying to find some of those other genes to reduce the number of times where people are told, seems like you have this, but we don't find it in any of the 2 genes we know for it. We would expect that there'll probably be at least 2 more genes for hypokalemic periodic paralysis, probably some for some of the others. And this is the process by which we will find it. We can't totally, there will, as people have mentioned in some of these studies that people do, when you're doing a study, you'll often want to do it on a genetically defined group of people, but one shouldn't have the attitude that other people should be dismissed. Those people should often be seen as the ones who will lead us to the other genes that we're going to find. And in the case of some of those, we think that there's going to be very common equivalents, less severe but common equivalents in the general population, and some of those will turn out to be the ones with widest clinical significance.
We have like 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, well, for the last 2 talks, since I was rushed onto the stage because we thought the timing was tight, but I'd certainly be glad to take questions.
You mentioned lights, sorry, you mentioned fluorescent lights, but what about LED lights? I know I'm certainly instantly affected by them, and I know they're
I don't know. I think
Yeah, like-
people who know about the electromagnetic field associated with those, I just don't know. I just know that I know it's been well documented for fluorescent lights that there's a lot, but
and all I know is LED ones are supposed to use a lot less electricity, but they're very, to me, I can virtually tell the difference, and I think they're LED ones here.
It really is a question of the power supplies, and when I was working with Emily Lau on this, I got the head of an electrical engineering department at a local university to be the one to deal with that directly, because I'm just not competent to answer those type of questions.
Oh, thank you.
This is from the internet. What's the name of the software and is it available? I should point out that this is a company that I founded called SimulConsult, as in simultaneous consult. It is available only to medical professionals, but one can go to simulconsult.com and encourage your doctor to sign up for it. At the moment, it's free. The new version will have some charge, but at the moment, the software is completely free.
Okay, well,
One more.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's just a note maybe that one of my jobs I use an EMF detector, and I can, when I'm in a room, say there's a lot of EMF, I can actually feel it before I even turn on the detector. But they are easy buy. They're about €30 here in Ireland, but they do help, like say, if you are kind of in a new, like a hotel or something like that, and you want to see if the room is suitable or not, they're very easy to come across and they do help. So I had one upstairs last night.
Well, we hope to get to the point where you're not considered nuts for bringing that up. When I was a medical student, we had this auditorium that was like in the old days. They had like 100 TV sets. You know, each 2 people would share this little TV set. It was before they figured out that you should just project it. But anyway, I'd walk into that room and there'd be this really high-pitched noise, and I would go to the people and say, like, could you at least turn it off when you're not using the TVs? And they'd say, what's the problem? We don't hear any noise. So we blindfolded me, and they would turn it off and on, and I would like put my hand up when I heard it, and I convinced them that it was real, and they did it. But But everybody knows that younger people can hear high-pitched noises. This is something where we're going to have to prove it, but we're going to do it.
Yeah, it is. Like you can just feel like I can just feel myself getting weak. If I walk into a highly static or electrical room, I can just feel I can just feel myself getting kind of a bit stupid or a bit weak, and
Right.
yeah.
The fact that one hears these accounts from this group and you don't hear them anywhere else suggests it's really related to this. Various people will make the argument that it's physically not possible, like they make the argument that it's physically not possible that electrical fields can induce tumor formation or something like that. I'm convinced that you guys are right, and I think we'll show it, but it's going to take real proving. I've seen newspaper articles about the phenomenon, and people make it sound like the people who are talking about this are a bunch of nuts, and it's. I think it's real, and I think it will be. We have to do it properly in terms of convincing people, because otherwise they'll tell the whole bunch of us that we're nuts.
Oh, we got one more question, Jeff, in the back there.
Does this electrical field thing include there's a couple of us that feel vibrating, and we touch people and we feel vibrating, and we touch a computer and it vibrates, and nobody else feels it, but we feel that zzz. Is this an indication of an electrical
I hadn't heard anything of the sort till yesterday, so I don't really have much to add to what you say, other than when we get to the point of finding one of the advantages of, lots of people have spoken of the disadvantage of focusing on the genetic type because it makes you feel, if you don't have one, that you're not taken seriously. But the flip side of the coin, in terms of the science, is the more we can say, yeah, we see this, but we see this only in people with this particular variant, people will take us seriously when we do that. So do you have a known variant? So does lidocaine work for you?
I was at the dentist last week and it was awful.
So we don't understand this yet, but it seems that a lot of the people who report some of these phenomena are ones for whom lidocaine doesn't work. And these people feel things that other people don't feel, like the women will often feel pregnancy way earlier than
pregnancy.
Than anyone else will. And basically, once we have the ability to say, oh, people with this variant in this gene feel such and such, it will not be taken as a threat to the belief structure of many others who will say, I've never seen it. I mean, we even get told that people have never seen lidocaine ineffectiveness, like people who've given it for 1,000 times and say they never have. Yet when I go up to an average person who tells me he has ADHD, a third of the time they tell me lidocaine doesn't work for them. So there's a real sociology to science, and I apologize to anybody who's sort of being asked to suffer in anonymity until this gets done, but hopefully we'll make progress on this soon, and the next set of newspaper articles will be saying, hey, this is real.
Can I just add something really brief? I use lignocaine patches for another reason, and they diminish the sensitivity.
Which lignocaine?
Sorry, just a really brief comment. I use lignocaine patches, skin patches, for a completely different disorder, and that has diminished my sensitivity to fluorescent lighting. It still exists, and lignocaine blocks sodium, potassium, and calcium channels. There's something.
So what we think is going on with the lidocaine is we don't think it's, so lidocaine works on sodium channels as well on others, but the main effect is on sodium channels. And so what we think is going on in normal people is it works very effectively, and there's a balance between sodium currents and potassium currents, and by knocking down the sodium currents, it quiets down the cells. In people who have hypokalemic, who have this unusual form of hypokalemic periodic paralysis, what we think is either the sodium current is higher or the potassium current is lower. It could be some of each. And it's just it's so out of the normal close balance that the lidocaine just isn't enough in normal concentrations to bring it down. So even in somebody who has normal lidocaine, for whom lidocaine works normally, you would imagine that's playing with the same balance and would bring down the some type of overstimulation. So it's not surprising that there should be effects like that.
Last comment from Emily, and then otherwise we're going to have hypoglycemic periodic paralysis. We got to go to lunch.
So I'll just say two things quickly about the EMF that might be helpful for anyone who's affected. One is that from the research I've done, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to be, from what I understand, that the mechanism is most likely that the cell membrane permeability that we have is why it's affected. It seems that I've seen studies that calcium ions in other people with channelopathies EMF can like pull calcium ions across cell membranes in maybe even healthy people, but especially in other people with other forms of channelopathies, which would make sense that would happen possibly to us and affect us. I don't know, that's my very unscientific hypothesis on why. So that's one thing.
Yes, some of that has been done in the context of these studies about whether electromagnetic fields can trigger cancers. And that's been some of the interesting data in recent years, is that it actually is more plausible than it was when people dismissed it 10 years ago.
So that just makes me feel a little less crazy. Anyway, that's the first thing. And I can sort of explain it in a sort of semi-scientific way to myself and others. And then the second thing is that EMF drops off, what's that word? Exponentially by distance. Thank you, whoever said that. So that as long as you can get some distance from whatever the source is, then it's much safer. And it doesn't necessarily, it does depend on the load that something's drawing, but anything that you turn on, depending on what is the current, I mean, if the electrical source, like if the house current or the building current is bad, then even if you're turning an LED light on, it might be drawing relatively little, but if the system is not good, then it still might be not good to be near that wall or outlet that's being turned on, if that makes sense. So while fluorescent lights might be worse, the LED lights also might be bad if that building is poorly wired to just be by the outlet itself when it's turned on. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. Okay, guys, the microphones are telling us to go to lunch. So thank you, Mickey. I think we're just one group. We just go to, where are we going?